That night, Dorian Whitlock walked through the front door with a new wedding ring on his hand. He said the old one had been lost somewhere between the office and the parking garage. Zariah Monroe wanted to believe him, because believing him had always been easier than asking the questions that kept her awake. By morning, she was driving to a quiet cemetery on the edge of town, searching for a necklace her late mother had left behind years earlier. In an unmarked grau, half buried beneath damp soil, she found something that turned her blood to ice, a copy of her own marriage certificate. The date matched the day she married Dorian. Her signature looked flawless, almost too perfect, but beneath her name was a line she had never seen before, one that read simply, "Marriage terminated," and the signature beside it did not belong to her husband at all. Dorian came home a little after 11 that night, moving with the same unhurried calm he always carried, as though nothing in the world could touch him. Zariah noticed the ring before he even set his keys down on the counter, the metal catching the kitchen light in a way that felt wrong, unfamiliar, like a stranger's hand had slipped into her marriage while she wasn't watching. She had memorized every curve of his old ring years ago, the thin scratch along the inside band from a fishing trip, the slight dent near the joint. This ring had none of that history. It looked new, and yet somehow it also looked worn, as if it had already lived through years it had no right to. She asked him when he had bought a new one. He answered too quickly, the words arriving before she had even finished the question, saying only that the old ring had gone missing. Zariah studied his face the way she studied contracts at work, searching for the smallest inconsistency, the phrase that didn't sit right. It wasn't the ring that unsettled her most. It was his finger, the pale indentation where a ring had clearly sat for a very long time, and yet this new one slid on, as though it had always belonged there. No adjustment, no awkward fit, nothing. Dorian changed the subject smoothly, asking about her day, mentioning dinner, doing everything a husband does when he wants a conversation to end. Zariah let him. She had learned that arguing too early only taught a liar how to tighten his story. She simply watched, filing away every detail the way she once filed away evidence during her paralegal years, back before she'd left the courtroom world for something quieter, something she thought would be safer. That night, once his breathing slowed into sleep, she lifted his hand gently from beneath the sheet and turned the ring toward the moonlight coming through the blinds. Engraved on the inside was a date, the same date as their wedding, precise down to the day. But behind that date sat a small symbol she did not recognize, a mark that had nothing to do with either of their families, nothing to do with anything she had ever chosen for their life together. A slow, cold thought moved through her. This was not a replacement ring. This felt like a ring that had already belonged to another marriage entirely, one she knew nothing about. She lay awake long after that, staring at the ceiling while Dorian slept beside her, undisturbed, his breathing slow and even, as though nothing in their bedroom had shifted at all. Zariah listened to the house settle around them, the quiet groan of the pipes, the distant hum of the refrigerator down the hall, and she found herself cataloging every small inconsistency of the last several months the way she once cataloged facts for a court file. A missed dinner here, a phone left face down on the counter there, a trip that ended a day earlier than planned, with no explanation offered and none requested. None of it had seemed significant on its own. Together, laid end to end in the dark, it began to form the outline of something she did not yet have a name for. By morning, Dorian announced he had a business trip, 3 days out of state. Nothing unusual, nothing she hadn't heard a dozen times before. He kissed her forehead on his way out the door, calm as ever. But just before he stepped outside, his phone lit up on the counter, and Zariah, standing only a few feet away, caught the message glowing on the screen before he snatched it up. 4 words sat there, plain and merciless. She still doesn't know. Zariah didn't confront him. She had learned long ago that confrontation only closed doors, while patience kept them open just wide enough to see through. Years before she met Dorian, she had spent a season working inside a small law office downtown, organizing case files, learning how the smallest inconsistency in a timeline could unravel an entire story if a person knew where to look. She had left that work behind long ago, drawn instead toward something quieter and more predictable, but the instincts had never fully left her. They simply waited, dormant, for a reason to wake up again. Instead, over the following days, she began quietly retracing the edges of her husband's life, the parts he assumed she never looked at. She opened the joint banking portal she rarely used, scrolling through months of transactions she had once trusted him to manage. She noticed his calendar had grown strange, filled with blocks labeled only with initials, meetings that started late at night and ended even later. Phone calls appeared on the account log at hours when he claimed to be asleep beside her. She began keeping a small notebook of her own, tucked inside a makeup bag no one would ever think to search, jotting down dates and amounts in a shorthand only she could read, treating her own marriage the way a careful auditor treats an unfamiliar company, trusting nothing until it had been verified twice. One charge caught her attention more than any other: a recurring payment to a place called Westmere Memorial Cemetery. Zariah sat with that name for a long moment. Dorian had no family buried there. His parents rested 2 states away, his grandparents even farther, and in all their years together he had never once mentioned Westmere. She brought it up carefully over dinner, phrasing it as idle curiosity rather than suspicion. He barely looked up from his plate. "Just an old payment," he said. "Something from before they met." The answer came too smoothly, too fast, the same rhythm as the excuse about the ring. She kept watching. A few nights later, while he slept, she examined the small velvet box the new ring had come in and found a receipt tucked beneath the lining. The ring hadn't come from the jeweler they always used, the one who had sized both their original bands years earlier. It had been custom ordered from a private shop across town. The order was placed under Dorian's name, but the pickup slip listed a second name beside it, a name Zariah had never once heard him speak: Evelyn Rook. She searched every corner of the house for that name and found nothing. No photographs, no letters, no trace in any drawer he had ever left open in front of her. But in a locked drawer beneath his side of the closet, one she had to work a bent hairpin into for several frustrating minutes, she found an old photograph tucked behind a stack of tax documents. Dorian stood beside a white woman with pale hair and a guarded smile, the two of them standing close in a way that suggested history rather than acquaintance. The photograph had been taken months before Zariah and Dorian had even met, according to the date stamped faintly in the corner. On the back, in handwriting she recognized instantly as her husband's, was a single sentence: "We'll start over from nothing." Zariah stood in the closet a long time, the photograph trembling slightly in her hand, one question settling into her chest like a stone. Who was Evelyn Rook, and why had her husband spent years making sure she never learned the name? She sat down on the edge of the bed and studied the photograph until the shapes of both faces burned themselves into her memory. The woman's pale hair catching the light of some room Zariah had never stood in, Dorian's arm resting easily around her shoulders in a way that spoke of familiarity rather than a passing acquaintance. It was the ease of the pose that unsettled her most. She knew that posture. It was the same one he used with her at family gatherings, the same casual confidence of a man standing beside someone he considered permanently his. Whoever this woman was, she had once occupied the exact space Zariah now occupied, and something about that realization made the house around her feel suddenly unfamiliar, as though she were a guest inside a life that had already been lived once before, under different terms, with a different name. When she finally set the photograph down, one detail returned to her with startling clarity. Westmere Memorial Cemetery. The same place. The same silence surrounding it. Somehow, she understood, before she even had proof, that Evelyn Rook was buried there. Zariah drove out to Westmere on a gray, quiet morning, the kind where the fog refuses to lift until well past noon. She hadn't told Dorian where she was going, only that she needed air, and he hadn't asked, too consumed with packing for his trip to notice the tightness in her voice. She wasn't going there to confront anyone. She wasn't even entirely sure what she was looking for. She only knew that the truth had started living in this place, and she needed to stand where it lived. The cemetery office was small, staffed by a single elderly caretaker who looked as though he had worked there longer than the headstones themselves had stood. Zariah asked about Evelyn Rook, spelling the name carefully, watching his face for recognition. He frowned, flipped through a worn ledger, and told her plainly that no record existed for anyone by that name. No plot, no marker, no paperwork. He hesitated before adding one more detail, almost as an afterthought. There was a section in the back, unmarked, reserved for graves without official records, the kind families sometimes paid to keep quiet. Zariah followed his directions down a narrow gravel path that wound behind the main grounds, past rows of neatly kept headstones into an older, wilder section, where the grass grew unchecked and the trees leaned close together, blocking out most of the light. The air changed as she walked deeper, cooler, heavier, the kind of silence that pressed against her ears. She counted rows without meaning to, the way she used to count exits in unfamiliar buildings. Near the back corner, half swallowed by creeping vines, she found a flat stone marker sunk deep into the earth, its surface worn smooth by years of rain. There was no name carved into it, only a date. Zariah crouched beside it and felt her breath catch in her throat, because the date carved into that stone was the exact day she had married Dorian Whitlock. She told herself it could be coincidence, though some quieter part of her already knew better. Kneeling in the damp grass, she noticed the soil beside the marker sat looser than the ground around it, as though it had been disturbed more recently than the stone's age would suggest. She dug with her bare hands, ignoring the dirt collecting beneath her nails, until her fingers struck something solid. A small metal box, rusted at the corners, sat buried just beneath the surface. Inside, wrapped in a plastic sleeve to protect it from moisture, she found a folded copy of a marriage certificate. Beside it lay an old wedding ring, dulled with age. Beneath that sat a photograph identical in feeling to the one hidden in the closet. Dorian standing close beside Evelyn, both of them younger, both of them smiling in a way that looked almost genuine. At the bottom of the box lay a single folded letter, its envelope never sealed, never sent. Zariah unfolded the marriage certificate first, her hands unsteady in the cold air. The name listed as the wife was her own, Zariah Monroe. The name listed as the husband was Dorian Whitlock. The date matched their wedding precisely, down to the hour recorded in the corner. But stamped diagonally across the entire document, in faded red ink that had clearly once been vivid, were two words that made the world tilt sideways beneath her: void, invalid. She stared at those words until they blurred, her mind racing to make sense of something that refused to make sense. If this certificate, the one bearing her name, her signature, her wedding date, was void, then what exactly had she been living inside for all these years? What ceremony, what vows, what promises had actually held any legal weight at all? She felt the ground shift beneath the question, the same way it had shifted the moment she first saw that new ring on Dorian's hand. She drove home slowly that afternoon, the metal box sitting on the passenger seat beside her, wrapped carefully inside her jacket so it wouldn't shift or rattle on the turns. The city moved past her window in the ordinary way it always did. People walking dogs, a delivery truck idling at a curb, a woman laughing into her phone outside a coffee shop, and none of it matched the quiet devastation sitting in Zariah's chest. She kept glancing at the box, half expecting it to disappear, half hoping it already had, because as long as it existed, she would have to accept that the life she thought she was living had never fully belonged to her at all. With trembling fingers, she opened the unsent letter tucked at the bottom of the box. The handwriting matched the photograph from the closet, sharp and familiar, unmistakably Evelyn's. Most of it read like a confession never delivered, fragments of fear and warning strung together by someone who clearly understood Dorian better than anyone else alive. But one line near the end struck Zariah harder than anything else in that box, harder than the void stamp, harder than the buried ring. Dorian didn't marry her to love her. He married her to erase Evelyn. Zariah spent the following days retreating into research the way she once had for court cases years earlier, methodical, quiet, relentless. She discovered that Evelyn Rook had not been some passing romance from Dorian's past, not a girlfriend, not a rumor. She had been his wife, legally and completely, married to him years before Zariah had ever entered his life. There had been no divorce filed anywhere in the public record, no legal dissolution, nothing that formally ended that marriage in the eyes of the law. At some point, Evelyn had simply vanished from every account of Dorian's life. He had told friends, coworkers, even distant relatives that she had died, offering vague explanations about illness or accident depending on who asked. Yet no death certificate existed for her anywhere Zariah could find. No obituary, no burial record beyond the unmarked stone hidden behind Westmere's back gate. Determined to understand more, Zariah tracked down an aging attorney named Calder Voss, a man who had once handled legal matters for the Whitlock family decades earlier, before quietly stepping back from that world. He agreed to meet her at a small diner outside the city, reluctant at first, clearly uneasy the moment she said Dorian's name. When she slid the copy of the void certificate across the table, his expression shifted from caution into something closer to dread. Calder had spent years telling himself he had left the Whitlock family's business behind for good, retiring quietly to avoid exactly this kind of conversation. He explained, haltingly at first, that he had once drafted paperwork for Dorian's father, and later for Dorian himself, back when the requests still seemed reasonable, still seemed like ordinary estate planning, rather than something darker. Somewhere along the way, the requests had changed, growing stranger, more specific, until the day he finally refused to sign his name to another document and walked away from the family entirely. He had hoped, he admitted, that walking away meant he would never have to think about any of it again. "You shouldn't have found this," he told her quietly, glancing toward the door, as though someone might be listening. Zariah asked him directly whether she was truly married to Dorian at all. Calder said nothing for a long moment, his jaw tightening, before he finally admitted what he knew. Years earlier, Dorian had become entangled in a bitter dispute over Evelyn's inherited assets, an estate large enough to reshape an entire family's future. If Evelyn died, or was legally declared missing, control of that fortune would pass directly to her husband. Calder explained that Evelyn had come from a family with old, careful money, the kind that had been managed cautiously across generations rather than spent freely, and that Dorian, by contrast, had inherited far less than his lifestyle ever suggested. Marrying into that fortune had given him access without ownership, a distinction that apparently gnawed at him more with each passing year. There had been one obstacle standing between Dorian and that fortune. Evelyn had never signed divorce papers before she disappeared, which meant that legally, in the eyes of every court and every bank, she remained his wife. To make that inconvenient truth disappear, Dorian needed something else entirely, a new marriage that could be used to quietly bury the old one beneath layers of fresh paperwork, a legal sleight of hand few people would ever think to question. Zariah asked the only question that mattered to her now. "What am I, then?" Calder looked at her with something close to pity and answered in a voice barely above a whisper, a name placed exactly where it needed to be. Before she left the diner, he slid a thin folder across the table, the kind of file that carried weight simply by existing. On its cover, typed in plain block letters, were two words that would follow her for the rest of that investigation: Project Monroe. Zariah opened the folder that night in the quiet of a locked hotel room, unwilling to risk reading it inside a house that no longer felt like hers. What she found inside chilled her more than anything from the cemetery ever had. Long before she and Dorian had ever crossed paths at that mutual friend's dinner party, someone had already been researching her, cataloging details of her life, with an intimacy that felt violating in retrospect. Her employment history, her financial standing, her family background, carefully noted for its lack of ties to anyone connected to the Whitlock name, her past relationships, listed with dates and outcomes, as though she were a subject in some clinical study, rather than a woman living her own life. None of it had ever been love, not in the way she understood the word. It had been architecture, a plan built brick by careful brick, and Zariah had simply been the material chosen to complete it. Dorian had needed a woman with an unblemished record, someone distant enough from his world that no one would think to question the documents he later placed in front of her, someone trusting enough to sign, without asking too many questions. She thought back to the early days of their relationship, the dinners that had felt so effortless, the conversations that stretched long into the night, the way he used to look at her, like she was the only person in the room. She thought about the proposal, the ring, the vows she had spoken with her whole heart standing in front of family and friends. Every one of those memories now wore a second meaning underneath the first, and she could not decide which version hurt more, the girl who had believed, or the woman now forced to see clearly. The folder even contained a page comparing her against other women Dorian had apparently considered before settling on her, a short list of names crossed out one by one, each rejected for some disqualifying detail: a sibling who worked in finance, a father with legal connections, a temperament judged too suspicious to be useful. Reading her own name circled at the bottom of that list, chosen the way a contractor chooses a reliable material, made her stomach turn in a way none of the earlier discoveries had managed. She had spent years believing she was the one who chose him, flattered by his attention, grateful for his steadiness. Now she understood that the choosing had only ever run in one direction. Further into the folder, she discovered something that turned her fear into something colder and more focused. Her signature had been used across multiple documents she had never seen, appearing on financial paperwork tied to accounts she didn't know existed. A hidden account bearing her name held a significant sum of money, money she had never deposited, never touched, never even known about. Alongside it sat records for a separate asset, also under her name, quietly tucked away within Dorian's larger financial structure. Zariah understood then that Dorian's plan extended far beyond simply hiding a previous marriage. He wasn't only trying to disappear his history with Evelyn. He was constructing a version of events where, if anything ever came apart, the blame and the legal consequences would land squarely on his wife instead of himself. She would be the one holding the paperwork when the questions finally arrived. There were nights during that period when the weight of it nearly broke through her composure, when she caught herself staring at old photographs from their wedding, searching Dorian's smile for some sign she should have noticed years earlier. She found none. That was, in its own way, the hardest part to accept, that a man could build an entire deception without ever once slipping, without ever once letting the mask fall in front of the person meant to know him best. She learned to set those nights aside quickly, folding the grief away like a document she wasn't ready to file yet, choosing instead to focus on the next piece of evidence, the next quiet phone call, the next small step toward understanding exactly what she was up against. She did not cry that night, though some quieter version of herself might have expected to. Instead, sitting alone with the folder spread across the hotel bed, she felt something inside her sharpen into resolve. If Dorian had spent years building a plan out of her, she would spend whatever time it took unbuilding it, piece by piece, until nothing remained standing except the truth. She thought about calling someone that night, a sister, an old friend, anyone who might tell her she wasn't imagining the scale of what she'd found. In the end, she called no one. She had learned enough by then to understand that the fewer people who knew what she knew, the safer that knowledge remained. And so she sat alone with the folder until the sky outside the hotel window began to lighten, memorizing every detail before finally allowing herself to sleep. When he returned from his trip 2 days later, Dorian pulled her into an embrace at the door, the same warmth in his voice she remembered from years earlier. He asked if she still trusted him, his eyes searching hers with what looked almost like genuine hope. Zariah smiled, let her hand rest against his chest, and told him, of course she did. Behind her back, hidden just beneath the folded edge of her cardigan, she held a copy of every document Calder had given her, proof enough to end everything Dorian had spent years constructing. In the weeks that followed, Dorian grew more insistent about paperwork, telling Zariah his company was undergoing a quiet restructuring and that certain assets needed to move formally into her name for tax purposes. He explained it all with the same practiced calm he used for everything, sliding documents across the kitchen table late at night, pen already uncapped and waiting. Zariah listened, nodded, and signed exactly where he pointed, letting him believe the woman across the table was still the trusting wife he had chosen years ago. Behind that performance, she had already begun working with Calder in secret, meeting him in places far from anywhere Dorian might think to look, a different diner each time, a public library, 2 towns over, once even the back row of an afternoon movie theater, where no one would think to glance twice at 2 people sitting quietly in the dark. Calder brought a caution to these meetings that bordered on paranoia, insisting Zariah leave her phone at home each time, reminding her that a man capable of erasing one wife from history would not hesitate to notice a pattern in his second wife's calendar. Each time Dorian handed her a new document, she quietly photographed it before returning it, then delivered the images to Calder for careful review. What Calder found confirmed her worst suspicion. If she signed these particular documents, she would become legally responsible for a tangled series of transactions connected directly to Evelyn's original estate, the very fortune Dorian had spent years trying to claim for himself. He was no longer simply hiding his past. He was preparing to hand Zariah the consequences of it, positioning her as the one who would answer for everything if the truth ever surfaced. She understood now why he had chosen her so carefully all those years ago, why her clean record and her distance from his world had mattered so much. She had been selected not only to erase Evelyn, but to eventually absorb whatever blame Dorian could no longer avoid. Zariah continued playing her part with quiet precision, appearing distracted at dinner, agreeable during his explanations, soft in the moments he expected softness. She let him believe she remained exactly where he had left her, unaware, unquestioning, safe to manipulate. Meanwhile, she pursued the one lead Calder had given her weeks earlier, the name of a woman who had once worked closely within the Whitlock household, long before Zariah had ever entered the picture. Her name was Maribel Sloane, a retired housekeeper who had spent nearly a decade managing the Whitlock estate before quietly leaving without explanation. Zariah found her living alone in a small house 2 counties over, and though Maribel was hesitant at first, something in Zariah's face seemed to convince her this conversation mattered. Maribel kept glancing toward the window as they spoke, as though old habits of caution had never fully left her even after so many years away from that house. She explained that she had loved Evelyn like family once, had watched her arrive as a bright, hopeful young bride, and had watched that brightness dim year after year until the woman barely resembled the one who first walked through the Whitlock doors. When Evelyn finally vanished, Maribel had quietly resigned within the month, unable to keep working in a house that felt, to her, like it was hiding something none of them were allowed to name. Over tea at her kitchen table, Maribel finally spoke the truth she had carried in silence for years. Evelyn had never died, she said. She had tried, more than once, to leave Dorian, to disappear from his reach entirely before he could tighten his grip further. But before she vanished for good, she had left something behind, a piece of evidence too important to simply carry with her. A notebook, Maribel explained, one that recorded everything, every plan, every falsified document, every quiet manipulation Dorian had ever set into motion, and she had hidden it somewhere she believed no one would think to search. The same cemetery where her own name had been erased from every official record. Before Zariah could ask anything further, Maribel reached across the table and took her hand, her expression suddenly heavy, with something like grief. "You are not the first woman he has used to hide the truth," she said quietly. And in that single sentence, Zariah understood that whatever waited for her back at Westmere would be far larger and far darker than she had ever imagined. Zariah returned to Westmere alone, this time with a shovel from the garage and a certainty that had replaced her earlier fear. She found the loosened patch of earth near the unmarked stone, exactly where she had left it weeks before, and beneath a slightly deeper layer of soil than the metal box, her hands finally closed around something wrapped tightly in oiled cloth. Inside was a thick, worn notebook, its pages swollen slightly from years underground, but still legible enough to read by flashlight. She had expected to find only Evelyn's name repeated throughout its pages. Instead, she found an entire list, names she didn't recognize alongside dates, transactions, and short notes written in Evelyn's careful hand. Former employees who had once worked for Dorian, women who had signed documents on his behalf, only to disappear from his life shortly after. People who had once been close to him and then, without explanation, simply weren't anymore. A slow, sickening realization settled over Zariah as she flipped through page after page. This wasn't the first time Dorian had done something like this. It was a pattern stretched across years, refined and repeated, each version slightly more careful than the last. Evelyn had simply been the one person strong enough to resist him, the one who had fought back instead of quietly fading away. Some pages included small, precise notes in the margins, dates crossed against bank transfers, initials matched to signatures that clearly didn't belong to the people who supposedly signed them. Evelyn had documented everything with the discipline of someone building a case she knew she might never live to present herself, and reading it, Zariah felt something between grief and admiration for a woman she had never met. Evelyn hadn't simply survived Dorian. She had spent her disappearance quietly preparing the exact weapon someone else would eventually need to finish what she started. Near the final pages, in handwriting slightly more urgent than the rest, Evelyn had written something that stopped Zariah's breath entirely. "If I die, find the woman Dorian marries after me. She will be black, she will be brilliant, and she will not know what she has been chosen for." Zariah sat in the damp grass a long time after reading those words, the flashlight trembling in her grip. Evelyn had known, somehow, long before Zariah had ever met Dorian, that another woman would eventually stand exactly where she now stood. She continued reading, and the deeper truth became clear. Zariah had not simply been chosen for her clean record or her trusting nature. She had been chosen because she possessed something Dorian could not obtain on his own: legal standing that could eventually be twisted to unlock the very fortune Evelyn had refused to hand over. And the new ring, Zariah now understood with total clarity, had never been about replacing something lost. It had been a signal, a quiet marker that Dorian believed his plan was finally nearing its conclusion. When she returned home that night, headlights off as she pulled into the driveway out of instinct rather than reason, she found Dorian already waiting at the kitchen table. 2 glasses of wine sat poured beside a thick folder she recognized instantly as another set of documents. His expression carried none of its usual warmth. Instead, it held the calm, unreadable stillness of a man who believed he had already won. "I think it's time we ended this marriage," he said, sliding the folder toward her. Dorian pushed the divorce papers across the table with the same practiced calm he used for everything, watching Zariah's face closely, waiting for the panic he clearly expected to surface. Instead, she picked up the pen without hesitation and signed exactly where he indicated, her handwriting steady, her expression unreadable. Dorian blinked, caught off guard by how easily she had accepted something he had assumed would break her. He asked if she didn't want to know why, his voice carrying a strange edge of disappointment, as though her calm had stolen something from him. Zariah simply said no, and meant it. What Dorian didn't understand, standing there in the kitchen light, believing he had orchestrated the final act of his plan, was that her signature on that page was only one small piece of a much larger strategy she had been building for weeks. Long before that night, she had already delivered copies of everything to Calder: every falsified certificate, every altered transaction record, every photograph from the locked drawer, Evelyn's notebook, the messages she had quietly saved from his phone, and the ring itself, which she had photographed in painstaking detail before ever placing it back on his finger while he slept. Calder had discovered something inside that ring, far more damning than either of them initially realized. Etched faintly along the interior band, nearly invisible to the naked eye, was a short alphanumeric code that matched the identification number of a private safety deposit box registered under a name Dorian had used only once, years earlier. Inside that box, once Calder gained lawful access through the proper channels, sat the original, unaltered documents proving exactly how Dorian had manipulated marriage and financial records to erase Evelyn from existence. Zariah didn't need violence to end what Dorian had started. She didn't need shouting, or accusations, or dramatic confrontation. All she needed was to let him believe he had already won completely enough to say the truth out loud himself. "You seem relieved?" she said quietly, watching him carefully across the table. Dorian said nothing. "Are you through hiding then?" she asked. Still nothing. She followed with a second question, her voice steady, almost gentle. "You did this to Evelyn too, didn't you?" Dorian's jaw tightened, but he said nothing at first. Zariah continued, calm and unwavering. "You thought I would never find that grave." For a long moment, the kitchen held nothing but silence. the kind that presses against the walls of a room until something inside finally gives way. Dorian's fingers tightened around the stem of his wine glass, his knuckles pale against the dark red liquid, and Zariah watched him carefully, refusing to fill the silence herself. She had learned, over these last weeks, that silence was its own kind of pressure, and that a man used to controlling every conversation would eventually find that pressure unbearable. Then Dorian's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough. Evelyn was supposed to disappear, along with every piece of paperwork tied to her, he said, his voice tight, with something between anger and exhaustion. Zariah didn't react. She didn't need to. She already had exactly what she came for. What Dorian failed to notice, standing there in his own kitchen, believing he had simply vented years of buried frustration, was the small recording device Calder had helped her place inside the light fixture above the table 2 days earlier. Every word he had just spoken now existed somewhere far beyond his control, and there would be no version of the truth he could rewrite to erase it. Within days, Calder moved quickly, bringing in a trusted colleague who specialized in estate law alongside investigators familiar with financial fraud. Together, they began unraveling years of carefully constructed paperwork, cross-referencing signatures, tracing hidden accounts back to their origins, and matching falsified documents against records Evelyn had preserved in her notebook. What had taken Dorian years to build began collapsing within a matter of weeks. Investigators traced the hidden account back through a chain of transfers designed to look ordinary at every step, small deposits routed through accounts, bearing Zariah's name, before eventually settling into holdings entirely under Dorian's control. Each transaction, taken alone, might have passed unnoticed. Together, laid across a single timeline, they told an unmistakable story of a man siphoning value out of one marriage while quietly building the appearance of legitimacy around another. The hearing room was smaller than Zariah had imagined, quiet in a way that felt almost anticlimactic given everything it would decide. She sat beside Calder, with a folder of her own, thinner than the one Dorian had once built around her, but far heavier in what it carried. Every page numbered, every exhibit labeled, every piece of the story arranged so that no one in that room could mistake coincidence for design. Dorian sat across the aisle, still composed, still dressed as though attending an ordinary business meeting rather than answering for years of quiet deception, and for a moment Zariah almost admired the sheer discipline of his denial. He tried, briefly, to shift the blame onto Zariah, suggesting to anyone who would listen that she had known about the falsified marriage documents from the beginning, that she had willingly participated in hiding Evelyn's existence for personal gain. But Zariah had prepared for exactly this moment. She presented the photographs, the hidden folder, the notebook, and finally the recorded confession that left no room for reinterpretation. Whatever version of events Dorian hoped to construct crumbled the instant investigators heard his own voice, admitting the truth. The most significant revelation arrived not through paperwork, but through a person. Evelyn Rook was alive. She had spent years living quietly under a different name, deliberately distant from anything connected to Dorian, terrified that resurfacing too soon would give him another opportunity to erase her permanently. When the investigation reached a formal hearing, she appeared in person, composed despite everything the moment demanded of her. Zariah stood only a few feet away from the woman she had once known, only through a hidden photograph and a buried letter. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "I used to think no one could ever get free of him," she said quietly. Zariah answered honestly, admitting she had once believed the very same thing. The two women stood side by side, not as rivals competing over a man's affection, but as survivors of the exact same deception, separated only by years and circumstance. Dorian was forced, piece by piece, to confront everything he had spent years hiding: his falsified documents, his manipulated marriages, his careful erasure of the woman who had refused to disappear quietly. The marriage between Zariah and Dorian was formally recognized as part of a larger scheme built on fraud, though by that point, Zariah found she carried little interest in preserving what remained of it. She wasn't fighting to save a marriage anymore. She was fighting to reclaim her own name from beneath the wreckage of his ambition. Just as the hearing seemed to reach its natural end, Evelyn approached Zariah quietly and pressed a sealed envelope into her hands. On the outside, written in the same careful handwriting Zariah recognized from the buried letter, were words that promised the story still hadn't reached its final page. "There is one more thing he never told you." Zariah waited until she was alone that evening, before opening the envelope Evelyn had given her, sitting in the quiet of a small rented room she had taken, while the divorce and investigation continued to unfold. Inside was a letter Dorian had apparently written years earlier, one Evelyn had kept hidden away, unread by him since the day she took it from his desk before disappearing from his life the first time. The letter confirmed something Zariah had already suspected. Dorian's plan had not begun the day he met her. It had started long before, carefully outlined in his own handwriting, describing the kind of woman he would eventually need to complete what Evelyn's resistance had left unfinished. Reading his own intentions, laid out so plainly, stripped away any final illusion Zariah might have still carried about the nature of their marriage. Yet buried within that same letter was a detail that struck her with unexpected weight. In the earliest years of their relationship, before ambition had fully hardened into calculation, Dorian had written honestly about beginning to feel something real for her, something that had briefly frightened him because it complicated the plan he had already set into motion. Not every moment between them had been manufactured. Somewhere along the way, in the middle of all his manipulation, something genuine had existed too, however briefly, however doomed. Zariah allowed herself only a short moment to sit with that truth before setting it aside. She thought of the woman she had been on her wedding day, certain of the ground beneath her, certain of the man standing across from her, and she understood now that certainty had never been proof of anything at all, only the absence of enough information. She was not that woman anymore, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not mourn her. She did not return to him. She finalized every remaining piece of the divorce, removed her name from every account and asset still tangled with his, and worked alongside Calder to legally reclaim what rightfully belonged to her, free of Dorian's fingerprints entirely. Before closing that chapter completely, she drove one final time to Westmere Memorial Cemetery, walking the familiar path toward the unmarked grave that had started everything. She knelt beside the worn stone and placed her old wedding ring gently into the soil beside it, not as a tribute to Dorian, and not out of sentimentality, but as a quiet burial of the version of herself who had once believed she wasn't strong enough to save her own life. Evelyn stood a short distance away, having asked to be there when Zariah returned. Neither woman said much. Zariah looked down at the weathered stone for a long moment before finally speaking. "I used to think this grave held a secret about someone who had died," she said quietly. She paused, watching the morning light break gently over the trees surrounding them. "It turns out it held the truth about the people who were still alive." The walk back toward the car felt longer than the walk in had, though the distance hadn't changed at all. Somewhere behind her, birds had begun stirring in the trees, and the fog that usually clung to Westmere's grounds had started to lift for the first time she could remember visiting. She thought briefly of the frightened woman who had first knelt at that unmarked stone weeks earlier, certain her whole life was unraveling, and she felt something close to compassion for her, the way a person might look back on an old photograph of themselves and finally understand what that version of them hadn't yet known. Zariah walked away from the cemetery that morning, without the ring, without Dorian, and without the counterfeit marriage that had shaped so many years of her life. What remained was simply her, a woman standing beneath a pale, breaking sunrise, carrying her own name forward for the first time in longer than she could remember, finally answering to no one but herself.